Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's special event launching the Middle East Institute's program on North Africa and the Sahel. This program will analyze the region's evolving internal, social, political, and economic dynamics, and will draw attention to the growing geopolitical significance of these countries stretching from coast to coast through the Maghreb and across the Sahara Desert. The program aims to provide a space to build closer regional ties and promote shared peace and prosperity. With cross-cutting issues such as climate, energy, and global security, it's more important than ever to have a dedicated program for this region. Leading this important initiative is Program Director and Senior Fellow Intisar Fakir. Intisar is an expert on North Africa, the Sahel, and key regional thematic issues, including governance, social change, migration, and security. Prior to joining MEI, Intisar was a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she was also the editor-in-chief of the bilingual Middle East platform, Saada. I'm also honored today to introduce my old friend and colleague, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for North Africa, Karen Sasahara, who will be providing keynote remarks. Karen has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for North Africa since November 2020. Prior to that, she served as Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Consul General in Jerusalem, and most importantly, Karen was with me as Deputy Chief of Mission in Sana'a and later Chargé d'Affaires for Yemen. Prior to that, Karen has also served as Regional Affairs Officer for North Africa, Egypt, Africa, and South Asia in the Office of Counterterrorism and the Libya-Tunisia Desk Officer, among many other postings. Karen has spent the majority of her Foreign Service career in Middle East posts or in assignments in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at State. I very much look forward to hearing from her today. With that, I would like to hand over to Karen to deliver her remarks, and that will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Intisar. So Karen, welcome, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you for that introduction, and to Director Intisar Fakir for organizing this event. It really is a pleasure to be here with you today to mark the launch of the Middle East Institute's program on North Africa and the Sahel. It's a part of the world that is near and dear to me, given my current assignment and having lived in Tunisia and been a Libya and Tunisia desk officer. But I also want to say it's a real pleasure to be here with MEI because I was an intern at MEI for the summer of 1982, and I have wonderful memories, and so it's a very important part of my professional development. So tomorrow marks the 103rd anniversary of the end of World War I, a conflict whose effects, along with the end of the Ottoman Empire, continue to influence politics across the world, particularly in North Africa. Vice President Kamala Harris is in Paris to commemorate that occasion tomorrow, along with other leaders from around the world. But one of the discussions that these leaders are going to be having will be at the summit on Libya, which has been organized by the French president, where Libyans and the international community will be discussing how to support the Libyan people's efforts to elect a unified national government, how to overcome the legacy of outsiders waging wars in Libyan territory, and how to chart their own course forward. The Sahel and North Africa have experienced a great deal of turbulent change. Ironically, however, a driver of the challenges of the region has more than often been that too little has changed rather than too much. For example, many of the factors that contributed to popular uprisings like the Arab Spring remain all too present. In many ways, the challenges facing North Africa today and facing U.S. foreign policy in the region relate back to those unresolved demands for change. Today, I would like to talk about three challenges affecting North Africa and the Sahel, which will require both local leaders and foreign policy practitioners to embrace change and undertake bold new approaches. These three challenges are unfulfilled democratic aspirations, socioeconomic inequality, and the climate crisis. The situations today in Libya and Tunisia typify the challenges democracy faces. In one country, the public is clamoring for elections. In the other, citizens are watching a crumbling economy and wondering whether they have seen the dividends of their 10-year-old democratic experiment. This is a sober reminder that democracy is neither binary nor linear, and backsliding is always a risk if citizens' frustrations are not addressed. Our acting Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, Yael Lempert, visited Tripoli on October 21st for a stabilization conference organized by the Interim Government of National Unity. This was her first time back since she managed the evacuation of our embassy in 2011 during the Libyan Revolution. 10 years later, Libyans welcomed her and other senior officials from around the world to support Libya's efforts to finally fulfill that revolution's aspirations in transitioning to democratic governance. She said it was amazing to see American flags lining the streets of Tripoli along with the flags of other summit attendees. But the challenges that remain are daunting, but it was hard not to be moved by the Libyan determination on display. After everything that they have faced, the Libyan people now have the best opportunity in a decade to lay the foundation for a stable democratic society. Now is the time for Libyan political leaders to seek consensus, prepare for national elections, and fulfill their commitment to the Libyan people to hold the vote on time. Meanwhile, in Tunisia, we continue to urge President Said to take concrete steps to return to normal democratic governance. The United States shares the Tunisian people's goals of a responsive democratic government capable of addressing the country's economic and health crises. We recognize Tunisian popular demands for reforms that improve the functioning of their democracy and urge President Said to ensure that any reforms are adopted through an inclusive process. One of the most significant threats to democratic governance globally, both in established and emerging democracies, is corruption and socioeconomic inequality. So this is the second theme that I would like to address today. In North Africa, the spread of market economies has brought tremendous revenue to parts of the region, but also inadvertently expanded the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Anti-corruption safeguards and governance systems have not kept pace with economic liberalization. People throughout the region consistently rank corruption among their top concerns. Even in Libya, where people are still striving to free the country from the shackles of intermilitia rivalry, this year's polling by the Arab Barometer showed that the economy had edged out security issues as the top concern. When the Arab Spring erupted in Tunisia in 2010 and then spread, protest chants called for social justice before any talk of regime change. More than 10 years later, frustration with corruption and inequality continues to drive Tunisian politics. The United States recognizes the risk that corruption poses to regional stability. One of the top issues that we will discuss at our December Summit for Democracy is how to combat the corrosive forces of corruption and inequality on democratic institutions. The summit aims to set forth an affirmative agenda for democratic renewal around the world. As President Biden has said, we have to prove that democracy still works and can improve people's lives in tangible ways. In North Africa, we're emphasizing pro-transparency and anti-corruption measures in our development programming. In February of this year, Secretary of State Tony Blinken awarded one of our inaugural Anti-Corruption Champion Awards to the chairman of Libya's National Oil Corporation, Mustafa Sanalla, for his apolitical management of Libya's oil resources throughout all the turmoil that the country has experienced. In Tunisia, we're working to strengthen accountability from the ground up by focusing on local governance and decentralization. Our programming is helping municipalities to provide essential public services in ways that are inclusive, efficient, and accountable. And meanwhile, Tunisian civil society organizations themselves are leading the way in combating corruption, with organizations like iWatch maintaining pressure on the Tunisian government to enhance transparency and inclusivity. Democratic reform continues to offer North Africa and the world the best chance at a stable and prosperous future. It will not follow a linear path, and advances and retreats are inevitable. New democracies will be particularly vulnerable as their service delivery systems race to catch up with citizens' aspirations. The United States will remain vigilant to these challenges and continue to help the countries of North Africa and beyond to overcome them. As grave as these ongoing political struggles are, there is another looming crisis which threatens to dwarf them all, which brings me to my third and final theme, the climate crisis. Climate change is one of the starkest examples of a problem that spans borders, and this is particularly evident in the Sahel and North Africa. So I want to commend the Middle East Institute for combining both areas into a single program. The Sahara has been expanding by more than 7,600 square kilometers a year, and is now 10% larger than it was in 1920. Drought has contributed to migrants from the Sahel moving northward, where some have found themselves dragged into new political military conflicts. Increasing climate volatility, desertification, and population growth have fueled conflicts over resources among Saharan tribal peoples. Sometimes such conflict feeds into violent extremism, contributing to region-wide threats to security. United States international engagement to address climate change, which has become a climate crisis, is more necessary and urgent than ever. As President Biden just said at COP26 in Glasgow, climate change is already ravaging the world. It's not a hypothetical threat. It's destroying people's lives and livelihoods and doing it every single day. But as he added, we can overcome this challenge, but we must choose to do so. We are working through USAID and other agencies to partner with countries throughout North Africa to develop new approaches for dealing with the challenges of climate change. In Egypt, USAID is running programming in 19 STEM high schools that teach environmental protection and provide a place for students to develop solutions for Egypt's climate adaptation challenges. Another program trains low-income technical secondary school students to install and maintain solar and wind energy plants. In Morocco, USAID is working with MIT to pilot a new ultra-low energy drip irrigation program aimed at cutting the energy required for pumping water by 50%. In a southern oil-rich desert region of Algeria, a MEPI-funded program is encouraging local entrepreneurs to pursue sustainable alternatives in renewable energy and green business. Confronting increasing impacts of the climate crisis and water scarcity in the region will also require not only immense effort by the countries in the region, but earnest diplomacy and international cooperation. The waters of the Nile flow through 11 countries. Concerns in Egypt about future water shortages have sparked tensions over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project. However, as the U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa recently said, we believe that Egypt's need for water security, Sudan's safety concerns, and Ethiopia's development goals can be reconciled through good faith negotiations on the GERD, and the United States will continue to be actively involved with all parties to that end. In a landmark regional dialogue convened by Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry in April, 10 Middle East and North African countries, including Egypt, unanimously agreed to reducing emissions by 2030. Through Special Envoy Kerry's efforts and our hundreds of diplomats posted to the region, we will continue to push for the type of concerted action warranted by the climate crisis. What strikes me about all three of the challenges that I've discussed is that the key to overcoming them is not holding on to the status quo, but rather embracing change, new ideas, and bold approaches. The launch of the Middle East Institute's program on North Africa and the Sahel reassures me that some of the best minds out there will be helping us all to do just that. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak to you, and congratulations once again.
Thank you, Ms. Sasahara, for your thoughtful remarks and for highlighting through them the importance of a program like ours that's focusing on North Africa and the Sahel. As you said, this is part of the world that holds tremendous geopolitical, commercial, and social potential, but it also holds risks as it is plagued by political, economic, and security challenges. So there is a need for greater attention and for deeper understanding. To that end, I'm really delighted to launch the North Africa and Sahel program, and I want to thank Paul Salem and Ambassador Firestein for the opportunity they've given me to lead this new effort and for their leadership, which makes it possible. We intend for this program to be about understanding where the region is, and more importantly, where it is heading. And that requires sober and honest analysis that showcases local voices as well as voices of experts from beyond the region. Through our research and events, our aim is to bring you original insights and encourage productive conversations about the region. And in that spirit, I'm delighted to have with me today two people whose work I have long followed and admired to discuss some of the themes that we have heard today. So first, I'd like to introduce Niagale Bagayuku, Chair of the African Security Sector Network. She is a political scientist who has done extensive field research on security systems in African Francophone countries, Western security policy in Africa and African conflict management mechanisms, focusing on security and development. Niagale has taught at the Institut d'études politiques, that's Sciences Po in Paris. She managed the peacekeeping and peacebuilding program at the International Organization de la Francophonie and was a member of the scientific committee of the Institut de Recherche Stratégique de l'École Militaire in France. Also joining me is Riccardo Fabiani. Riccardo is a longtime Maghreb expert. He's currently the director of International Crisis Group's North Africa program. Riccardo has more than 10 years of professional experience as a political analyst and economist on North Africa. He held positions at Eurasia Group, Energy Aspects, and other consultancies. His writing has been published in Carnegie Endowment Sada Journal, which is how I got to know him, Jadaliya, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and the Financial Times. He's a frequent commentator on regional affairs, and I'm delighted to have him and Niagale here today. So Niagale, Riccardo, hello, welcome. I'm so glad you're able to be here with us as we launch this new program. So I want to start our conversation today by looking at some of the areas of tension around the Maghreb and the Sahel. Over the past few weeks, new tensions have risen between Morocco and Algeria. And Riccardo, could you explain for us some of the drivers of this conflict and lay out your vision for short and long-term outcomes for what we see happening between these two neighbors today?
Of course, and first of all, congratulations on the start of this new program, and thank you for having me today as one of your guest speakers. I think that when we look at the conflict or the tensions currently rising between Morocco and Algeria, we really need to have a look at the past, I would say at least 20 or 30 years of diplomatic relations between Algeria and Morocco. Maybe we should say the lack of real diplomatic substantial relations between these two countries for the past at least 20, 30 years. Of course, the disagreement between these two countries goes back a long way since, I would say, almost the independence of Algeria and the famous Sands War. But if we look at the past 20, 30 years, it's important to remember that there was what we could call a crystallized precarious balance or equilibrium between these two countries. Effectively, from the 90s onwards, particularly with the ceasefire in the Western Sahara between Morocco and the Polisario, a very precarious security arrangement, an implicit one, of course, an unspoken one, effectively took over in the region. There was a conflict, as I said, in Western Sahara between Morocco and the Polisario, which is supported, as we know, by Algeria. That was frozen. There was a diplomatic framework in place to deal or to try and deal with that issue. And there were obviously very low level, but still existing diplomatic relations between these two countries with, recurring tensions, of course, and a closed border and so on. But this situation effectively created a very precarious balance between these two countries and avoided a deterioration in the security picture. What we have seen quite interestingly over the past 1.5 years, I would say, is a modification or a change in this precarious balance. We have seen particularly the end of the ceasefire, the collapse of the ceasefire between Morocco and the Polisario. We have seen the the Trump administration, I should say, decision to recognize Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara and the normalization, diplomatic normalization between Israel and Morocco. And obviously we have seen at the same time great, I would say, instability inside Algeria. All these factors have really I would say, led to a change in this precarious equilibrium, have really altered the status quo, and have led to an increase in tensions between these two countries, exactly because the previous balance that was based on a frozen conflict and a de facto substantial equality in military terms between Algeria and Morocco has now been changed. And there is a perception, particularly in Algeria, that they need to do something, they need to send a strong message and strong signal that they don't accept a change in the status quo, and that whatever new status quo is going to be created will have to take in consideration Algeria's perspective and Algeria's security interests in the equation. And this is a little bit, I would say, the background of the current tensions that we have seen, that we are currently witnessing, the escalation, I would say, if we can call it that way, between Morocco and the Polisario, but also, most importantly, the security incidents that have led to fears of a possible open war, open confrontation between Morocco and Algeria. There is now a need and a lack, I would say, for a new security arrangement, whether explicit or implicit, between these two countries that could secure their national security interests while avoiding an escalation between the two countries, and most importantly, at the same time, trying to find some sort of framework or forum where talks over Western Sahara can be resumed.
Niagali, do you see this crisis between Morocco and Algeria as having any impact on Sahel security? And more broadly, how do you characterize the present security situation in the Sahel, considering the impact of the pandemic, the rise of terrorist activity, and political unrest across the region? You're muted, Niagali.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today. As regards the impact of the tensions between Morocco and Algeria regarding Western Sahara in the Sahel, I would say that it has been indirect in the Sahel itself. Because as the conflict was frozen, there was no real influence of it. But it's very important to say that among some jihadi leaders, you had a lot of them coming from Polisario and from Western Sahara. In particular, it is the case of Adnan Abu Walid al-Sahrawi, who used to be the leader of the so-called État islamique au Grand Sahara, Islamic States in Greater Sahara, which is a branch of the Islamic State in Central Sahel, who was just naturalized by the French military 2 months ago. You had other important leaders from EIGS, such as Abu Hakim al-Sahrawi, also originating from Western Sahara. And it seems that today the leadership of this jihadi group is again reorganizing itself around figures coming from Western Sahara. It is also very important to stress the central role of Algeria in the way in which the northern part of the Sahelian crisis has been managed for years, not only from the beginning of the new crisis in 2012, but also during the 90s and during the 20s. You had first the agreement of Tamanrasset, which involved Tuareg leaders and National Malian Authority, which was signed under the aegis of Algeria. Then you had in 2006 the so-called agreement, Algiers Agreement, which was also found under the aegis of Algeria. And finally, you had you do have presently l'accord pour la paix et la réconciliation au Mali, issu du processus d'Alger, which is also conducted and put under the authority of Algeria as regards its implementation. As Algeria is in fact heading the committee of implementation of this conflict. So this is about the role of Algeria and Morocco. As regards the broader situation of the Sahel, I think it is important not to put all in all, because in my view, one of the problems today is that everybody seems to try to link any global phenomenon to very local trends and security dynamics. In my view, this is the case, for instance, of COVID-19, which of course do have an impact on the daily lives of Sahelian people, but which can definitely not be compared to what is happening in Europe or in the United States, or even in Latin America or in Asia, because the region is among those which have been the less touched by the pandemic. So seeing everything through the lenses of the pandemic, in my view, is very problematic. Second, climate change as well. I reassure you, I'm not at all skeptical about climate change. But when I'm hearing that among the deep roots of terrorism is climate change today, I think it is rather problematic, but because it is also a way to approach this conflict in a non-political way. It is also an approach which is, in fact, giving no responsibility, no direct responsibilities to the actors themselves. So I think we're very careful. The evidences of the linkages between climate change and violence and conflict in the Sahelian region are far from proven. And I think it is very important to address each phenomenon on its own, and not once again to put everything in everything.
No, that's a good point, Nyagali. So let's talk about the role of local actors themselves. Let's talk about the set of challenges that they face. Can you explain a little bit some of the drivers of state weakness and how those are playing into these regional and local conflicts that you are referring to?
Sorry, could you please repeat, because I have a problem with my sound?
Yeah, so you were talking that you were essentially saying that we need to look at the role of these domestic actors. So talk to us a little bit more about the role of these domestic actors and the set of governance challenges that are contributing to some of these security issues that we're talking about.
Okay. I think it is absolutely crucial to consider that you have a very large set of different actors which do have an impact on the Sahelian crisis. Of course, you do have jihadi groups, and among them, it is very important to make a difference between those affiliated to Al-Qaeda and those affiliated to the Islamic State, in particular because they are fighting one to each other. It's impossible to look at jihadi dynamics in the regions under the lens of fighting terrorism as a whole, because you do have differences in terms of vision, in terms of agenda, in terms of political, economical, educational approach between all those groups. And it seems that the project of jihadi groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda are much more integrated in a coherent visions than those of the Islamic states. Second, you do have the rebel groups themselves. Rebel groups such as the Tuareg ones who are signatories of the peace agreement of 2015 and who are completely different actors. Some of them can have some links to, for instance, Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, but the larger majority of them are simply have been fighting to promote initially independence and then autonomy and development of the region in the north. Even if you look at Chad, which is also part of the Sahel, you do have political military groups which absolutely do not have any link to jihadism or Islamism. It's absolutely crucial to look also at those actors. There is also a growing importance of self-defense groups and militias would also do have developed very important areas put under their own governance. You also have criminal actors who do not have any political, nor ideological, nor religious agenda, who do matters as well. Finally, you can see also that military actors are absolutely central into the crisis, not only on the ground, because some units were found or have been suspected to be guilty of human rights abuses, but also because now among the five G5 Sahel countries, you do have two junta who are in power in Mali and in Chad. And this is also because governance has been at the origin of the crisis, and also the disillusion against with democracy, I would say.
Just a quick reminder to our audience that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section. Ricardo, we're talking about domestic dynamics and unrest, and that's definitely been a feature in Maghreb countries as well. Do you think these social tensions in Maghreb countries have similarities across Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, or should we view each of these countries through its own separate lens?
Well, I do think all these crises that we have been seeing in the Maghreb have something in common, and I think it would be a mistake to underestimate the commonalities between all these countries, specifically because we are obviously naturally very focused on the specific features and challenges of what is happening in Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco, but we also need to remind ourselves that there is something, I would say, a broader process in place right now that is currently taking place in the region. And I would argue that, probably in terms of political instability and the search for a new model, the region is really going through what we could probably call a fourth wave, a fourth historical wave. And when I say a fourth wave, I'm referring basically to the first wave as the early post-independence periods, which was characterized by authoritarian politics and, for example, import substitution economic policy. Then there was a neoliberal period where political and economic systems were under pressure, particularly from the outside, to partially and slowly open up. Then we've seen the democratic experiment phase throughout the past decade, when, again, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia were under pressure from the inside and externally as well to liberalize their political and economic systems. Now, what we're seeing right now, I would probably call this the current context as a fourth wave. Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco are all reviewing their political and economic priorities. They're trying to meet, the demand for stability and economic development that remains at the core, I would say, of all, these changes, of all these developments on the ground. But all of these countries are really showing probably similar symptoms, right? If we can call them like that, of course. A focus on protecting sovereignty that was not there really before. There's a growing nationalist rhetoric in all of these countries, particularly to mobilize their own populations, but not only. There is a desire to diversify external political and economic and security ties. And there is also a return to industrial policy in economic policy terms that was not there for a very long time. These, I would say, are things that we can really see in common across these countries. Of course, each country has its own features and history that we need to take in consideration. Algeria is facing a very strong democratic movement that is not really there in Tunisia, where we see that public opinion has actually shifted against parliamentary democracy. In Morocco, there is a degree of political continuity that really hides the fact that the monarchy has actually adapted its priorities and tactics over the past decades to changing domestic and external circumstances. But, considering all of this, I still think that these variations, these differences have really, they still hide the fact that there is something in common that we are only now starting to see. And that's really the beginning of a process of looking for a new political and economic and social and security arrangement that could potentially benefit or satisfy, let's say, the demands coming from this new coalition of interests of social groups and lobbies that is putting pressure in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco on the political authorities to change and to take a new direction in policy terms.
Ricardo, I want to go back to the point about new political and economic arrangement and what that might look like. But you mentioned something, sort of a thread that also came up in some of Niegale's comments, which is the role of external actors, this desire to diversify alliances. Niegale, can you talk a little bit about that and what we are seeing in terms of the presence, particularly of Russia and the Wagner Group in Mali after their involvement in Libya and the Central African Republic, and also China? What are we seeing in terms of China's presence in the Sahel? What sort of role does it see for itself, and what does that entail?
That's fine. You can hear me? Okay. I think that your question is the question which is in fact raised by all observators or practitioners. But in my view, it is a way to look at Sahel current conflictuality with very, very old lenses. Russia, first, is absolutely not a new player in a country such as Mali. There is nothing to compare with the role played by Russia in the Central African Republic, which is definitely a new one, and its influence in Mali, because it is a very old one. It's important to remember that just after independence, the first political leader, the first president of Mali, Modibo Keïta, decided to put an end to all relationships with France, in particular as regards military cooperation. And he decided to cooperate very strongly with the former USSR and other socialist countries. And this is a way which has been followed up by Moussa Traoré, who overthrew him 10 years later. So that's the first thing. Russia is not a new player. And even in 2012 or in 2019, there has been formal agreements for cooperations between Mali and Russia. Second, what about China? That it is also coming to what I'm saying. Why putting everything in everything? I'm sorry, China, yes, is definitely an economic competitor in Africa, but on the security aspect, yes, it has an influence within the United Nations, and it is willing to be a key player in the Security Council, but this is traditional, but also in peacekeeping operation, etc. But I cannot see anything particular from China as regards security itself in the Sahel. Third, I think that we also have to clearly, and maybe it is one of the missions that should be taken by your institute. What is exactly the role of Middle East countries in Sahel? What about their role, not only today, but also in the past 30 years, where they have been exporting a new vision of religion via schools, madrasa, health center. And this is also about influence. Influence and competition is not only between states themselves. You also do have influence, which is disseminated by other actors who do matter a lot in the Sahel. And finally, it is important to recognize the fact that Islamism is not only about violence and armed fighting. It is also about politics, and you do have in the Sahel, particularly in Mali, but also in a very different way in the Niger, very strong religious forces, which are also important actors and which do have links with Middle East states. So let's not be always keeping the same kind of perspective, which is coming from the Cold War, if I may say. Today, things are changing. So seeing Russia or China everywhere, I'm not sure it is something which is helping a lot to understand what is currently the situation on the ground. Their influence on what is happening is, in my view, completely marginal today.
So then explain, please. You're talking about the role of Arab actors. Explain more about what they're doing and how it's shaping the. Can you explain more about what they're doing and how it's shaping the political and security trajectory, since you are mentioning that? You're muted.
Because you muted me. Sorry. I don't know. That's better. That's fine. You can hear me. No, I think there is a need to recognize the fact that the traditional Islam, which used to be the most influence in the Sahel region, is now cohabitating with another form of Islam, which had been coming from Gulf or Middle East countries. And the relationships are very important in terms not necessarily of violence, but also in terms of how the societies themselves are shaped, and also in the way social services can be delivered. Those actors have also to be looked at very, very carefully, even if they are not playing a very classical diplomatic role, I would say. That it is very important to look also at more grassroots level dynamics. Once again, it's not only possible to read international relations today under an interstate perspective, under a realist perspective. Also, of course, this is important and does matter, but you also have more transnational or more informal relationship which do have impact on security and politics, at least as regards the Sahel region. But also, if you look at what is happening today in Sudan, you can see that the Emirates do have also a very interesting diplomacy toward Sudan. And so I think that those actors also do have to be carefully studied.
Okay, Ricardo, do you, in talking about the role of external actors in the Maghreb, these, of course, these are, for Russia, certainly they've had a long-term relationship with Algeria and presence. Do you agree with what Niagale is saying about we shouldn't really worry about what's going on there in that regard? And also talk a little bit about the role of Gulf actors. Tunisia is looking to the Gulf for funding, and Morocco is also revamping its relationship with Israel. What does all of this portend for the region's geopolitical balance?
Well, I do agree that there is a tendency to scaremongering when it comes to outside actors in the region. Of course, the two biggest outside actors in the Maghreb have been for decades the Europeans and the US, and we never really worried about those ones. And now that there are other players, other actors coming in and trying to play a role that can be constructive or obviously not so constructive at times, we shouldn't necessarily condemn their presence, without a priori. Basically, we should always consider what role and what kind of contribution they're making to regional stability, to regional security, to regional development, and so on. And I would say, more in general, that the role of these outside actors has really increased because of what I like to call the process of decoupling between the Maghreb and the Europeans and the Americans. Right? We've seen that the Europeans are divided and they focus a lot on migration and security. They have a very sort of narrow perspective on North Africa, at least lately. They cannot, most importantly, I would say, and they don't want to play a leading role when it comes to relations with the Maghreb. The US, at the same time, is selectively disengaging from the region. It still, of course, plays a leading role on many issues, but is less hegemonic or is less committed, if you like, to the broader region. But at the same time, and this is again where I agree with Niagale, we should also consider what's happening on the ground, because this is not just power politics. It's also a matter of the demands coming from the bottom. And I would say that there is, as I said before, growing bottom-up nationalism or the demand for sovereignty, let's say, in the Maghreb, that is making it harder for traditional outside actors like Europe and the US to actually play the same role that they used to play before. This nationalism goes hand in hand with a demand to diversify external ties, both in political and economic terms. So, in a way, in a sense, the room for maneuver for the Europeans and Americans has really either shrunk or at least changed. Right, the space has really been modified, and this is where the new outside actors are really playing an increasingly influential role. Obviously, there are many examples, right? We've seen Russia and Turkey becoming more and more entrenched in Libya, and the question of their security presence, most importantly, how long this is going to go on for, is now, I would say, very much justified. We don't know whether they're there for the short or for the long term. We've seen the Gulf countries playing a more and more important role in the region. Tunisia has turned, for example, to the UAE and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis for financial support because they cannot secure, apparently, or it's becoming increasingly harder for them to secure the financial support they need from the IMF and from the Europeans and the Americans that are considering, among other things, reducing or potentially even leveraging aid, even though obviously this is not something that they have yet decided on. But at the same time, the Gulf countries are also playing a role, for example, in Morocco. We've seen the UAE being at the forefront of the countries opening consulates in Western Sahara, recognizing Morocco's claim to this area. And Israel as well, right? Israel is now a key actor in relation to Morocco, and it's a key actor, I would say, in the escalation between Algeria and Morocco. There is a perception in Algeria that Israel is on Morocco Morocco's side, and most importantly, is now willing to transfer technology, equipment to the Moroccans, which could alter the precarious balance of power between Algeria and Morocco that was in place, as I said before, for the previous 20, 30 years. So these new actors, in some cases, do play, obviously, a disrupting role, but disrupting, obviously, from our perspective, from the perspective of our interest in the stability of the region, or sometimes even in the idea that a frozen conflict such as the one in Western Sahara could go on like this forever, right? And these new actors are there to also, I would say, meet a genuine demand coming from these countries. So what I would say probably is that they are here to stay, these new outside players. They need to feature in the considerations of the policy community in Washington, Paris, Brussels, or what have you, if we want to really understand what is happening in the region and what policy options are still realistically available. There are constraints, but there are also opportunities. So we shouldn't necessarily assume automatically that these actors are there to disrupt stability or to undermine, let's say, the stability of the region. They could play a constructive role, obviously depending on the circumstances.
I want to, maybe as we sort of get towards the end of the event, one of the things that I hope to accomplish with the program, and this is a question for both of you, Ricardo and Yagale, is to really begin to kind of integrate the study of North Africa and the Sahel better. So I want you guys, if I want to hear your opinion of this and see if you can talk a little bit about the role of Maghreb actors in the Sahel, vice versa. We heard a little bit from Niagale about the indirect kind of relationship in terms of security, but what other ties bind these countries? Trade, cultural, religious exchange. I want to hear from both of you. What can we kind of explore in terms of this relationship? Ricardo, we can start with you.
Okay, sure. So I'll start by saying that obviously there is again a trend, a tendency in Europe and in the US to securitize the set of ties that connect the Maghreb with the Sahel. As you point out, Intisar, these ties are actually multiple. Their nature is very diverse. We're not just talking about non-state actors or jihadist groups crossing the sort of line that divides the Maghreb from the Sahel, but we're also talking most importantly about cultural, religious, economic ties, community, inter-community or intra-community ties in many cases, and so on and so forth. So if we think, for example, for a moment about Morocco's religious ties in the Sahel and West Africa, the so-called religious diplomacy that was a little bit of a trend in research terms a few years ago. And that is centered, as we know, on the role of the king as the commander of the faithful, but also, most importantly, Morocco's training programs for African imams in West Africa and the Sahel, and Rabat basically trying to spread its moderate interpretation of Islam. But we also need to, we can also consider Morocco's growing investment, economic presence in the area, particularly under Mohammed VI. When it comes to cultural ties, we know, for example, that there are Tuareg communities that straddle this, the somewhat artificial, let's say, distinction between the Maghreb and the Sahel. And even the Arabic names, right, for the Maghreb and the Sahel are effectively geographical definitions. These are not necessarily, definitions that indicate a clear or, I would say, neat and well-defined separation between these two worlds or these two spaces. We know that there are basically several and multiple connections between these two areas. And one, for example, that we tend to often overlook or, again, securitize when we consider the connections between the Maghreb and the Sahel is the smuggling routes, for example, that we tend to look at, for example, from a perspective of non-state actors exploiting them or drug trafficking taking place or human trafficking. But often smuggling is a resource for many border communities to actually get by, to live, and also to reinforce those existing connections that have been there for many years, and they have been cut and interrupted by artificial, colonial borders effectively. So I would say the most important point here is that and I really believe that this is what your program your program can really play an important role here, is to desecuritize this approach. Start looking at these connections from a more, I would say, ground up sort of perspective, and look at these ties as from a pre-political and pre-security perspective. Of course, on these ties, on the basis of these connections, political and security strategies and policies are built, and we cannot deny that. We know what the fall of the Gaddafi regime did to Sahel security and stability. We know what kind of role Algeria has been playing, the stabilization in attempts to stabilize Mali and so on. But I would say the key issue here is that if we just look at the role of the Maghreb countries from a geopolitical perspective, in the opposition, for example, between Algeria and France over Mali and the Sahel, etc., we lose sight of a series of other aspects that really play an important and fundamental role in both the Maghreb and the Sahel. And that's where I think the securitization often comes at the expenses of development, comes at the expenses of the actual long-term stability of these two areas.
Yes, thank you very much. I will be very quick. I could not agree more with Ricardo about this issue of securitization of everything, and the importance of looking at the grassroots dynamic, which are not necessarily security related in essence. And but I also do think it is important to look at the diplomatic ties and the diplomacy which are developed by Maghreb countries toward Africa in general, and toward Maghreb and toward the Sahel in particular, because there has been, especially as regards Morocco, a shift in the foreign policy. Morocco used to look at Europe, etc., especially under Hassan II, but with Mohammed VI, there has been a very crucial change, which is African diplomacy. And one of the best example is the attempt at Morocco to become a member of ECOWAS, the West African Economic Community, for economic and political reasons, of course. And similarly, the foreign policy of Algeria toward the countries of the region is very rich and has a very old tradition, and also has to be looked at as such, and not only in relation with security or with the role of external actors, etc. The relationships between all those states are much more deep than we Western actors tend to suspect or to look at them.
Thank you, guys. We are almost at time, but I'm going to take the opportunity to ask just a couple of questions that we have from our audience that we did not touch on. So I'll start with one for you, Nyagale. This is from our non-resident scholar, Bill Lawrence. I agree strongly with your opinion on climate change in general, but could you address the real climate crisis in the Lake Chad area, its destabilizing effect, and how the international community should view it? I'm going to take one more question also for Ricardo. This is on Libya. Ricardo, what is the impact of the Libya crisis on the Sahel and vice versa? Nyagale, you can also weigh in on that, and we'll go ahead and start with you.
I'm definitely not an expert of climate change, and nor an expert of Lake Chad. But I think that you have very different approaches of what is happening on the ground, especially and in particular some researchers which are demonstrating that in fact you do not have in the Lake Chad region the kind of climate phenomenon such as drought, disappearance of waters. The trend tends to be completely different. So I don't know how those challenges have to be addressed. But once again, I think it is also, of course, there is a need to have a large view on the different challenges, but not necessarily an integrated one. And I might be a bit provocative about this, but I'm not sure that all those integrated approaches, those interagency approaches, which do have their own logic, I can understand them, are helping to improve the situations on the ground, because it happened to be very, very challenging to address all the challenges all together. And I think that this question of climate change not has to be overlooked, of course, but it had to be approached very carefully and not to be seen as the explanation behind everything, as has been the case for terrorism, for instance, and we have seen what happened with that.
Ricardo?
Yes, I think as you know, as the connections between the Libya crisis and the situation, the stability of the Sahel is concerned, I mean, it's quite clear, and this has been clear, I would say, even almost from the start, from the beginning of the uprising and the transition in Libya, that the many connections that were already existing between Libya and some of the countries south of it were going to have an impact on the stability of this region. And we've seen it obviously in Mali, and we've seen it more recently, obviously. In Mali, obviously, that was one of the factors that really led to the destabilization of the north of this country. In Chad, recently, we've seen it with what happened politically, and let's say the power transition that took place. But what I think is what I want really to highlight here is that these connections are present. There are security, obviously. There are non-armed groups, non-state actors, really, that play a role in the Libyan crisis, originating from Sudan and various other Sahel countries. These non-state actors are still present in Libya. They have, let's say, fought on either side, sometimes even switching sides depending on the circumstances. Libya has really become some sort of, if you like, a training ground, but also an opportunity for many of these, young fighters to find some sort of outcome, to find some sort of space where they could actually be hired, guns for hire, effectively. What we often forget in terms of policy community here is that when we talk about the security arrangements in Libya, we tend to focus almost exclusively on the Wagner group in Libya and the Turkish presence in Libya. And the biggest conversations take place around the need to withdraw these forces from the Libyan scenario. The reality is that there are still considerable numbers of Sahelian and African fighters present in Libya that will also have to go back home at some point. And their return home is not necessarily a straightforward process. There needs to be thinking in depth regarding the absorption of these groups back into their society, the disarmament, most importantly, of these groups, and the reintegration, basically, of these fighters into society, into the politics of their countries, most importantly, a process of pacification, let's say, between these groups that were often, opposition groups to the existing regimes in the countries where they come from. And this is the kind of effort that requires not just resources, but also diplomatic work on the existing regimes, in some cases, obviously, and the existing political arrangements in these countries, to make sure that when the Libyan transition is over and these groups have to return home, their return home will not just destabilize these countries or will not just become an additional factor of tension in these countries. There needs to be a diplomatic, military, and economic work to facilitate, let's say, the reintegration of these groups. And I think this is something that, in part, the military commission in Libya has begun to do. They've recently published some plans around that. But that's where I think the international community can really play a role in supporting these plans, in making them more concrete, more practical, and in, I would say, providing those resources that are needed to make sure that this process is as smooth as possible, and basically that the end of the transition in Libya doesn't necessarily have negative repercussions on its neighbors, but actually has positive repercussions in the long-term stability of these countries.
Thank you for that, Ricardo. I'm sorry we were not able to get to all of the other questions. This is really all we have time for today, but this is just to kind of give you guys a sense of some of the events that we'll be holding in the future. So please come back with your questions, keep following our work. And just to close, I want to thank everybody at MEI for their support. I want to thank Ricardo and Niagale for joining me today. Thank you both so much for your thoughtful responses. And I look forward to working with you guys again in the future. And thank you to everyone who joined us today.